I still remember the smell of chalk on my fingers. Not the kind you find in classrooms. This was different, drier, sharper, mixed with the damp of cellar walls and the faint tang of fear that clung to everything in those days. I was 9 years old when I first drew a bird with wings too big for its body, perched on a fence that didn't exist outside my head. Mother said it looked like hope. I didn't know what hope looked like then. I only knew it felt like something you held onto when the world kept trying to take your hands away. We lived in a small flat above a tailor's shop in Warsaw, tucked between a bakery that stopped baking and a bookshop that no longer sold books. The windows were always half-shuttered, not because of the cold, though it was always cold, but because of what might be seen from the street. My father used to say light was a luxury we couldn't afford. Still, every evening, just before curfew, he'd crack the shutters a sliver and let in the last amber of the day. That light, that fragile golden thread, was where I learned to draw. Paper was scarce. We tore pages from old ledgers, the backs of ration slips, even the inside of cigarette packets when we could find them. I'd sketch with charcoal from burnt twigs or the stub of a pencil passed from hand to hand like a secret. My drawings weren't good, not in the way grown-ups meant good, but they were honest, a cat with 3 legs, a teacup steaming in winter, a soldier's shadow stretching long across cobblestones. I drew what I saw, what I missed, what I feared, and sometimes, just sometimes, what I dreamed. There were 5 of us in that flat: mother, father, my little sister Lena, old Mr. Zalewski from downstairs who'd lost his wife to fever, and me. We shared bread like it was scripture, passing it with reverence, breaking it with care. Lena was 6, all knobby knees and wide eyes that followed mine, like I knew the way out of everything. She'd sit beside me on the floor, knees drawn to her chest, watching as I made lines become something else. "Draw me flying," she'd whisper. So I did. Over rooftops, over soldiers, over silence. The first time I heard the word ghetto, I thought it was a kind of bread. It sounded heavy, dense, something you'd chew slowly to make it last. But it wasn't bread. It was walls. Not the kind you build with bricks, though there were those too. These walls were made of glances, of lowered voices, of doors that stayed shut even when someone knocked. They were built with rules that changed like the weather and fear that never lifted. We moved into the ghetto in the autumn of '40. I remember the leaves, crisp and copper, stuck to the soles of our shoes as we walked. Mother carried a single suitcase. Father held Lena's hand so tightly his knuckles turned white. I clutched my sketchbook to my chest like it might shield me. The streets inside were narrower, the air thicker. People moved like ghosts, shoulders hunched, eyes down. But even there, life found its cracks. A woman humming a lullaby through a cracked window, a boy trading buttons for a sliver of soap, a violinist playing softly in a doorway, notes curling like smoke into the grey sky. It was in that place, in that impossible place, that I met Eli. He was older, 12, maybe 13, but small for his age, with hands that moved like birds in flight. He'd been drawing longer than I had. His sketches were sharper, bolder. He drew faces with eyes that looked back at you, not away. One afternoon, he showed me a portrait of his sister. She'd vanished the week before. "I draw her so she doesn't disappear twice," he said. I didn't understand then, but I do now. We started meeting in the attic of a half-collapsed building near the wall. It was our studio, our sanctuary. We'd sit on splintered floorboards, backs against cold brick, sharing a single stub of charcoal. We drew maps of streets we'd never walk again. We drew gardens with flowers that bloomed in colors we'd forgotten. We drew freedom, not as a flag or a speech, but as a door left open. A sky without barbed wire, a table with enough chairs for everyone. Sometimes we didn't draw at all. We just sat in silence, listening to the city breathe. Or try to. The distant rumble of trucks, the sharp bark of orders, the muffled sobs behind thin walls. In those moments, drawing felt like prayer, not the kind with words, but the kind with lines, each stroke a plea, each page a promise that we were still here, still human, still capable of making something beautiful in a world bent on breaking us. Mother began hiding my drawings under the floorboards. "In case," she'd say, tucking them between the joists like seeds waiting for spring. I never asked what she meant by "in case." I didn't need to. We all knew the shape of that word. It lived in the pause between heartbeats, in the way Father's voice dropped when he spoke of the trains, in the way Lena stopped asking for sweets and started asking if tomorrow would be safe. But safe wasn't a place. Safe was a moment. And in those moments, with charcoal on paper and Eli beside me, I felt it. Not safety exactly, but something close. A kind of quiet defiance, because to draw was to say, I am still here. I see. I remember. I imagine. Winter came hard that year. Snow fell like ash, muffling sound, blurring edges. We burned furniture for warmth, then books, then memories. Still, I drew. My fingers stiff, my breath fogging the page. But I drew. A snowman with a scarf made of hope, a candle burning in a window, a hand reaching out one night during an air raid, though we never called them that. We called them the quiet hours. Lena crawled into my bed. She was shivering, not from cold, but from the thunder of engines overhead. "Draw us somewhere warm," she whispered. So I did. I drew a beach. I'd never seen one, but I'd read about them in a book Father used to read aloud. Golden sand, blue water, palm trees bending like dancers. I drew us there, barefoot, laughing, with the sun on our faces. She fell asleep, tracing the lines with her fingertip. That drawing is gone now, like so much else, but I remember it. Not just the image, but the feeling, the weight of her head on my shoulder, the rhythm of her breath slowing, the way the world outside could roar and rage. But in that room, for those few minutes, we were free. They say memory fades, but some things don't fade. They settle, like dust in corners, like chalk on skin, like the echo of a child's voice asking you to draw her flying, and so I did, again and again. Not because I believed we'd escape, but because, in the drawing, we already had. The first snow of 42 didn't fall. It drifted in like a question, soft, uncertain, as if even the sky wasn't sure whether to stay or go. By then, the attic had become our cathedral. Not because it was grand, far from it. The roof leaked, the floor groaned, and the wind slipped through cracks like a thief, but because in that space, we worshipped something fragile and necessary, the act of making meaning when meaning seemed impossible. Eli brought a new sketchbook that winter. It was bound in faded blue cloth, the kind you'd find wrapped around love letters or grocery lists in better times. He'd traded 2 buttons and a silver thimble for it, priceless currency in a world where warmth and dignity were measured in scraps. "For the archive," he said, handing it to me with a seriousness that made my throat tighten. I didn't ask what archive he meant. I just nodded, and that night I drew the first page, a single candle burning on a windowsill. Its flame shaped like a child's hand. We began calling our drawings the Book of Maybe, not because we doubted, but because maybe was the closest thing to hope we dared name. Maybe tomorrow will be quieter. Maybe they won't come for us tonight. Maybe someone will find these pages one day and know we were more than numbers, more than silence. Lena started drawing too. Her lines were wobbly, her proportions all wrong. She gave cats 6 legs and trees faces, but there was a joy in them that made my chest ache. She drew us as giants, striding over rooftops, holding hands with clouds. "We're big enough to scare the dark away," she told me once, smudging charcoal across her cheek like war paint. I didn't correct her. I envied her certainty. Mother grew quieter as the months wore on. She still cooked when there was anything to cook, and mended clothes until the fabric gave up entirely. But her eyes had begun to look through things, not at them. Sometimes she'd stand by the window long after curfew, her silhouette sharp against the blackout cloth, as if waiting for a signal only she could see. One evening I found her folding one of my drawings into a paper boat. "For the river," she murmured, though the Vistula was miles away and frozen solid. I didn't ask. I just watched her place it gently on the sill, where the moonlight caught its edges like silver. Father, on the other hand, spoke less, but moved more. He'd disappear for hours, returning with flour sacks or a jar of pickled beets, or once a single violin string. He never said where he went. We never asked. In that world, questions were luxuries. Trust was the only language we had left. It was Father who first suggested we teach others to draw, not as a lesson, but as a lifeline. "If they can imagine," he said one night over thin soup, "they can endure." So we began quietly, carefully. A girl named Miriam, whose hands shook from hunger, learned to draw birds with wings wide enough to carry her. A boy called Jakub, who hadn't spoken since his brother vanished, sketched entire cities in the margins of ration cards, towers, bridges, streets that led somewhere safe. We met in shifts, never more than 3 at a time, always in the attic, always after dark. No one brought paper. They couldn't afford to lose it. But we shared ours, page by page, passing drawings like bread. There was no instruction, only invitation. Show us what you miss. Show us what you dream. And they did. A mother's braid, a dog's bark, the smell of rain on hot pavement, things the world outside had tried to erase. But memory refused to surrender. I remember one afternoon, grey still, the kind of day that feels like holding your breath, when Eli and I sat side by side, drawing the same thing without speaking. A door. Not a grand entrance, not a gate, just a plain wooden door with a brass knob. Mine was slightly ajar, light spilling through. His was closed, but with a keyhole, and through it you could see green. We looked at each other and smiled. No words needed. We both knew freedom wasn't a place. It was a threshold. And we were learning to cross it one line at a time. But the world outside didn't care for thresholds. It cared for lists, for quotas, for efficiency. The deportations began in earnest that spring. Not with fanfare, but with whispers. A neighbor gone, a shop shuttered, a silence where a voice used to be. We learned to read the air, the way it thickened before a raid, the way footsteps paused too long on the stairs. One morning, Mr. Zalewski didn't come up for breakfast. We found his door unlocked, his bed neatly made, his coat gone. On the table, a single drawing, a pair of spectacles resting on an open book. No name, no date, just that. Mother folded it carefully and tucked it into her apron pocket. We never spoke of him again, but sometimes, when the light hit just right, I'd catch her touching that pocket as if checking that the memory was still there. Lena began having nightmares. Not the usual kind, monsters under the bed, but quieter, sharper terrors. "What if they take my drawings?" she asked one night, clutching her latest sketch, a sunflower taller than a house, to her chest. I told her they couldn't, that drawings lived in the mind first, and no one could steal that. But even as I said it, I felt the lie in my bones. They could take everything. They already had. Still, we drew, even when our fingers were numb, even when the charcoal snapped, even when the only thing left to draw was the shape of waiting. Then came the day the wall moved, not literally, though it might as well have. The ghetto shrank overnight, like a lung collapsing. Streets we knew were suddenly on the other side of a new barrier, guarded by men with rifles and eyes that didn't blink. Families were split, homes abandoned. Our attic studio, now on the wrong side of the new line, was lost to us. We stood at the edge of the new boundary, staring at the building like it might remember us. Eli's face was pale, his hands clenched. "The Book of Maybe," he whispered. "It's still up there." I wanted to run, to climb, to tear the boards apart with my bare hands. But Father's grip on my shoulder held me still. "Not today," he said. And in those 2 words, I heard the weight of everything we couldn't save. That night we started again. On the floor of our new room, smaller, colder, shared now with 2 other families, we laid out what little paper we had. Lena drew a ladder made of stars. Miriam sketched a bird carrying a key in its beak. Jakub drew a door, this time wide open, and I drew Eli's face. Not as he was then, hollow-eyed, trembling, but as I remembered him in the attic light, focused, fierce, full of quiet fire. I drew him holding the blue sketchbook like a shield, because if we couldn't keep the place, we'd keep each other. In lines, in memory, in the stubborn, sacred act of saying, you were here. You mattered. You imagined. Weeks passed. The air grew heavier. Rumors spread like frost. About camps, about trains that didn't return, about silence so complete it swallowed names. Father stopped coming home some nights. When he did, he smelled of smoke and something metallic I couldn't name. Mother stopped folding paper boats. She began sewing hidden pockets into the hems of our coats. Just in case, she'd say, her needle moving like a heartbeat. One evening, as snow began to fall again, this time harder, angrier, Eli knocked on our door. He was alone. His coat was torn, his breath ragged. He didn't speak. He just held out the blue sketchbook. He'd gone back, risked everything. Climbed through rubble, past patrols, into the attic one last time. Inside, every page was filled. Not just ours, others too. Drawings we'd never seen, left by hands we'd never know. A child's handprint, a recipe for apple cake, a map of a village with a heart drawn over one house. At the very back in shaky script for those who come after. Remember us not as we were taken, but as we dreamed. We sat in silence for a long time, the book open on our knees. The snow falling outside like the world was trying to bury us gently. That night, I dreamed of flying, not over rooftops but through pages, each one a window. Each one a world we built because the real one had broken, and when I woke I knew, even if they took our bodies, they couldn't take our drawings. Because drawings don't live on paper. They live in the space between heartbeats, in the pause before a name is forgotten, in the quiet courage of a child who dares to imagine a door and then draws it open. The summer of 43 arrived not with warmth, but with a kind of suffocating stillness, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. The air in the ghetto grew thinner, not from lack of oxygen, but from absence. So many faces gone, so many voices stilled. You could walk down a street and hear only the creak of a shutter, the scuttle of a rat, the distant hum of a generator that never stopped. It was in that silence that the drawings became louder. We kept the book of maybe hidden now, not under floorboards, but sewn into the lining of Mother's coat, wrapped in oilcloth, pressed flat like a secret pulse against her ribs. She carried it everywhere, even to the communal latrines, even to the bread line, where people stood with eyes lowered and shoulders curved like question marks. "It's safer with me," she'd say. And we believed her, not because it was true, but because we needed to. Eli stopped coming to our room. Not because he didn't want to, he did, but because movement had become a language of risk. Every step was a sentence, every glance a confession. We communicated in glances across courtyards, in folded notes slipped under doors, in drawings left on windowsills like breadcrumbs. Once I found a tiny sketch tucked into my shoe, a single key, drawn so small it fit on a matchbox. Beneath it 2 words, "Keep going." Lena grew quieter, but her drawings grew bolder. She began filling the margins of old schoolbooks with forests made of hands, hundreds of them reaching, interlacing, forming canopies where birds nested in the crooks of fingers. "They're holding each other up," she explained, as if it were obvious. And maybe it was. In a world where falling meant disappearing, holding on, even in ink, was survival. Father returned less often. When he did, he spoke in riddles. "The river is rising," he'd say, or "the baker's oven is too hot." We learned to listen for the truth beneath the words. The river meant escape routes. The oven meant danger. One night, he came home with mud on his boots and frost in his beard, though it was June. He handed me a small tin box. Inside, 3 pencils, unbroken, untouched by time or hunger. "From the other side," he whispered. I didn't ask what that meant. I just held them like relics. We used one that very night. Lena sharpened it with a kitchen knife, her tongue poking out in concentration. The first stroke on fresh paper felt like a miracle, smooth, dark, deliberate. I drew a classroom, empty desks, a blackboard with the words, "We were here," written in looping script. Not as a plea, as a fact. That summer we began teaching the youngest ones not to draw what they saw, but what they remembered. A grandmother's shawl, the taste of honey on Rosh Hashanah, the sound of a lullaby sung off-key. Memory became our resistance, because if they could erase our streets, our names, our bodies, then we would build a world inside our minds so vivid, so stubbornly alive that it could never be burned. One afternoon, during a rare lull in the patrols, Miriam brought her little brother to the room. He couldn't have been more than 4. He clutched a stub of red crayon like a talisman. He didn't speak, just sat on the floor and drew a circle. Then another, until the page was full of suns. When he was done, he looked up at me and said, "For the dark." I nodded. No one cried. But something in the room shifted, like a door opening in a place we didn't know existed. It was around then that the whispers began. Not about deportations, but about uprising. Not with guns, not yet, but with spirit. People started meeting in basements, passing notes, sharing plans, wrapped in hope so thin it trembled. Father's absences grew longer. His hands, when he returned, bore new scars, small, precise, like he'd been gripping something sharp. One evening, he sat with me by the window, the last light catching the grey in his temples. "They're going to fight," he said, not looking at me. "Not to win, but to be seen." I didn't understand then, but I do now. To be seen was to refuse invisibility, to say, "We are not cattle, we are not numbers. We are people who loved, who dreamed, who drew birds with too many wings." The night before the first shots rang out, Eli came to us one last time. He slipped through the shadows like smoke, his face gaunt, his eyes burning. He didn't stay long, just long enough to press a folded sheet into my hand. "For the archive," he said, echoing his words from that winter long ago. Then he was gone. I opened it later, under the blanket by the dim glow of a candle stub. It was a portrait of me, not as I was, hollow-cheeked, wary, but as I might have been in another life, standing in a sunlit field, sketchbook in hand, wind in my hair, smiling like I knew joy was mine to keep. At the bottom, in his careful script, "You will remember for us all." The next morning, the ghetto woke to gunfire, not the distant kind, not the kind that belonged to someone else's tragedy. This was close, raw, human, shouts, glass shattering, the sharp crack of wood splintering under boots. We huddled in the corner, farthest from the door, mother clutching Lena, father standing like a wall between us and the world. Outside, the sky filled with smoke, not black but grey, the colour of grief. For days, the fighting pulsed like a fever. We heard it in the walls, in the floorboards, in the silence between screams. We didn't leave the room. We barely spoke, but we drew, with charcoal, with pencil stubs, with fingernails on scraps of paper. We drew maps of courage. We drew hands passing bread through cracks. We drew Eli, standing tall in a street of fire, holding not a gun, but a sketchbook, and then, as suddenly as it began, it quieted. Not peace, never peace, but a different kind of silence, one that carried the weight of endings. The Germans had won, of course. They always did, but something had changed. You could feel it in the air, like the aftermath of lightning, charged, altered. Father didn't come home that night, or the next, or the one after. We waited, we listened. We pretended not to notice the way Mother's hands trembled when she smoothed the lining of her coat. A week later, a neighbour, a woman we barely knew, slipped a note under our door. Just 3 words he crossed over. We didn't ask what that meant. We knew. He joined the fighters in the sewers, in the ruins, in the last pockets of defiance. And he hadn't come back. That night, I took the blue sketchbook from Mother's coat. She didn't protest, just watched as I turned to a blank page and began to draw him, not as a soldier, not as a martyr, but as he was on Sunday mornings before the war, sitting at the kitchen table, reading the paper, one hand resting on Lena's head, the other holding a cup of tea that steamed like a promise. Lena watched me draw. Then, without a word, she picked up a pencil and added something I hadn't. A small bird perched on his shoulder, its wings open, ready. We didn't speak. We didn't need to, because in that room, in that moment, we weren't just remembering. We were keeping him alive, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Autumn came not with color, but with ash. The leaves that fell were grey, dusted with soot from buildings that no longer stood. The ghetto, what was left of it, felt less like a place and more like a scar, raw, exposed, aching in the wind. We were fewer now, so much fewer. The rooms around us stood empty, doors hanging open like mouths that had forgotten how to speak. Yet we remained, not because we were brave, though sometimes bravery wore the face of exhaustion, but because there was nowhere else to go, and no one left to take us. Mother grew thinner, her bones sharp beneath her skin like the frames of unfinished drawings. But her hands never stopped moving. She mended, she folded, she tucked. She carried the book of maybe as if it were a child she hadn't lost. Sometimes in the quiet hours before dawn, I'd catch her tracing the spine with her thumb, her lips moving in silent conversation with ghosts. Lena, too, changed. She stopped drawing sunflowers and flying cats. Her lines grew tighter, more deliberate. She began sketching faces, dozens of them on the backs of old ration cards. Not idealized, not softened, but true. The curve of Miriam's brow, the way Jakub's hair fell over his eyes, the gentle slope of Mr. Zalewski's nose. "So they don't fade," she said once, not looking up. I didn't tell her they already had. To the world outside, yes, but not to us. Not in the book, not in the lines. We heard rumors of camps, not just names, but whispers of what happened there. We didn't speak of them aloud. Instead, we drew what we hoped existed beyond them, fields without fences, rivers that flowed clean, houses with open doors and smoke curling from chimneys like breath. We drew futures we weren't sure we'd live to see, because imagining them felt like stitching a lifeline across time. One afternoon, a woman we'd never seen before appeared at our door. She was young, maybe 20, with eyes that held too much knowledge for her age. She didn't give her name. Just handed Mother a small bundle wrapped in burlap. Inside, 2 onions, a wedge of cheese and a child's drawing. A crude but joyful sketch of a dog chasing butterflies. On the back, in a looping hand, "For the ones who still dream." Mother wept then quietly into her apron. Not from hunger, though we were hungry. Not from fear, though we were afraid. But from the unbearable tenderness of being remembered. That night, we added the drawing to the book of maybe. It didn't belong to us, yet it did, because in that world, every act of kindness was a shared language. Every drawing, a hand reaching through the dark, then came the order, not shouted, not posted on walls, just passed from mouth to ear, like a secret too heavy to carry alone. They're liquidating what's left. We knew what that meant, final, absolute, no more maybe. Panic didn't rise like a wave, it seeped in, slow and cold like water through cracks. Mother began burning papers that night. Not the drawings, never those, but letters, photographs, anything with a name or date that could tie us to a past they wanted erased. The flames in the stove flickered like dying stars. Lena watched, silent, then went to her corner and drew a phoenix, not from memory but from instinct. Father was gone, but his absence had become a presence now, a shape in the room, a weight in our breaths. I found myself speaking to him in my head, as if he might still hear. I'm keeping them safe, I'd think. I'm drawing them home. The next morning, Mother woke us before light. She moved with a calm that frightened me more than tears ever could. She dressed us in layers, wool over cotton, coats over coats, as if we were preparing for a journey through winter. Then she knelt, opened the lining of her coat, and pressed the book of maybe into my hands. "You carry it now," she said. Her voice didn't shake, but her eyes did. "Where are we going?" Lena whispered. "Somewhere they won't look," Mother replied. And that was all. We left at dawn, slipping through alleys we'd memorized like prayers. The city was eerily quiet, as if holding its breath. Smoke still curled from distant ruins. A crow called once, sharp and lonely. I clutched the book to my chest, feeling its edges dig into my ribs like a heartbeat. We weren't heading for the trains. Not this time. Mother had made other arrangements, through whispers, through debts, through the quiet network of people who still believed in mercy. A farmer, a seller, a false name, a chance. But chances have prices. At the edge of the ghetto, near a collapsed bakery we used to pass on our way to school, we met the man who would take us. He was broad-shouldered, with a face like worn stone and eyes that didn't linger. He nodded once, no words, just a gesture. Follow. Mother turned to us then. She knelt, cupped our faces in her hands, first Lena's, then mine, and kissed our foreheads. Her lips were cold. "Remember who you are," she said. "Not what they say you are. You are artists. You are witnesses. You are love made visible." Then she stepped back. I didn't understand at first. "Aren't you coming?" I asked. She shook her head. "They're watching for families, for groups. It's safer this way." Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled as she smoothed Lena's hair. "Go, and don't look back." But Lena started. "Don't look back," Mother repeated, firmer this time. And in her eyes I saw it, not just sacrifice, but strategy. She was giving us the only thing left she could, a future unburdened by her presence. The man tugged my sleeve. Time was running out. I wanted to argue, to beg, to wrap my arms around her and never let go. But something in her gaze stopped me. It wasn't resignation. It was resolve. She was choosing us over herself, and in that choice she was drawing her final line. So I took Lena's hand. And we walked. We didn't look back. Not then. Not until we were deep in the countryside, hidden in a hayloft that smelled of earth and animal warmth, did I allow myself to cry. Lena curled into me, silent, her small body shaking. I held her and the book, both trembling, both precious. Days passed. Then weeks. The farmer, Jan, he told us his name was, brought us bread, water, sometimes a boiled egg. He didn't speak much, but every evening he'd leave a scrap of paper by the trapdoor. Once a pencil stub, another time a page torn from an old almanac. "For the little ones," he'd mutter, never meeting our eyes. We drew in secret, by candlelight shielded with cloth. We drew Mother's hands, Father's laugh, Eli's quiet intensity. The attic with its slant of golden light. We drew the world we'd lost, not to mourn it, but to keep it alive inside us. One night during a storm that rattled the roof like fists, Lena whispered, "Do you think they can see us?" I knew who she meant. Not the soldiers, not the patrols, the others. The ones who didn't make it out. "I think they're with us," I said. "In every line we draw." She nodded, then added softly, "Then we have to keep drawing. So they don't get lonely," and so we did, even when our fingers were stiff with cold, even when the paper was damp, even when hope felt like a distant country we'd never visit, because drawing wasn't just memory, it was promise. And in that hayloft under a sky that didn't know our names, we promised to remember, not just the horror, but the humanity. Not just the loss, but the love that persisted in its shadow. We drew freedom not as escape, but as continuity. As long as one child held a pencil, the world hadn't won, and we were still holding on. The war ended not with a bang in our corner of the world, but with a slow unfurling, like a flower opening in a room that had forgotten sunlight. One morning the farmer came to the hayloft and simply said, "It's over." No fanfare, no celebration. Just those 3 words, spoken as he might announce rain or the price of potatoes. But they landed like thunder. Lena and I climbed down, stiff from months of stillness, blinking in the daylight as if we'd been born again. The world outside was greener than I remembered, wilder, as though nature had rushed in to cover the wounds while we weren't looking. Birds sang with a boldness that felt almost defiant. I wanted to believe it was joy. Maybe it was. Or maybe it was just life, stubborn and indifferent, doing what it always does, going on. We didn't return to Warsaw, not right away. There was nothing to return to. The flat above the tailor's shop was rubble, the bakery, the bookshop, the street where we'd played hopscotch with chalked stones, all gone, swallowed by fire and silence. Jan offered to let us stay through the summer. "You're safe here," he said, and for the first time in years, the word safe didn't feel like a lie. We began to speak again, real words, not just whispers. Lena asked about Mother every day at first, then less often. not because she forgot, but because the asking began to live inside her, quiet and constant, like a second heartbeat. I never told her what I suspected, that Mother had walked straight into the arms of the roundup that day, buying our escape with her own. Some truths are too heavy for small shoulders. I carried that one for us both. Instead, I showed her how to draw trees with roots deep enough to hold the earth together, how to sketch rivers that flowed towards something, not away, how to fill a page with light, even when your hands remember only shadow. The book of maybe survived. Water-stained, smoke-tinged, its blue cover frayed at the edges, but intact. One evening, as fireflies blinked in the fields like fallen stars, I opened it for the first time since the hayloft. Lena leaned against me, her head on my shoulder as we turned the pages. There was Eli's bird with the key, Miriam's sons, Jakub's open door, Mr. Zalewski's spectacles, Father's teacup steaming in winter, Mother's paper boat drawn from memory after we'd lost the real one, and Lena's forest of hands, still reaching, still holding. We didn't cry, not then. But something shifted in the air between us, soft and sure, like the turning of a season. Later that summer, a man from the Jewish committee came to the farm. He wore a suit that didn't quite fit and carried a ledger full of names, some crossed out, some circled, some waiting. He asked us questions gently, as if afraid to startle us back into hiding. When he saw the sketchbook, he grew very still. "May I?" he asked, and I handed it to him without hesitation. He turned the pages slowly, his fingers trembling slightly. When he reached the back, the page with the handwritten note for those who come after, he closed his eyes for a long moment. Then he looked at us, really looked, and said, This is history. Not the kind they'll write in books, the kind that matters." He offered to take it to an archive in Krakow, where it would be preserved, studied, shared. I hesitated. It felt like giving away a piece of our bones. But Lena, who rarely spoke to strangers, said quietly, "They should know we dreamed." So we let it go. Not because we were ready, but because we understood. Memory isn't meant to be hoarded. It's meant to be passed on, like bread, like breath, like a pencil from one hand to another. We left the farm in early autumn. Jan pressed a small wooden box into my hands as we stood by the gate. Inside, a fresh pencil, a new sketchbook with clean white pages, and a single acorn. "For planting," he said. I nodded. No words could hold what I felt. Warsaw was a skeleton of itself, buildings half-standing, streets scarred with tank tracks, the air thick with the smell of wet plaster and old smoke, but people were returning, not the same people, never the same, but people nonetheless. They swept rubble from doorsteps. They hung laundry between ruins. They planted flowers in cracked pots, life again insisting. We found a room in a shared house near what used to be the university. It had one window, a stove that smoked, and walls thin enough to hear your neighbor's sighs. But it was ours. That first night, Lena and I sat on the floor and drew the same thing without speaking, a table set for two, with bread, with light. In the years that followed, I never stopped drawing, not professionally, not in the way people mean when they talk about artists, but as a practice, a prayer, a pulse. I drew the faces of survivors I met in displaced persons camps. I drew children learning to read in makeshift schools. I drew weddings held in courtyards where bombs once fell, always with the same intention to say, "You are seen, you are here, you are more than what was done to you." Lena became a teacher. She taught art to orphans, to refugees, to anyone who needed to remember they had hands that could create, not just survive. She never spoke much about the war. But her classroom walls were always covered in drawings. Bright, bold, full of impossible skies and animals wearing hats and houses with doors wide open. Freedom, she'd tell her students, starts with a line. I often wonder what happened to Eli's key. to Miriam's birds, to Jakub's cities in the margins. But then I see a child sketching a sun on a cafe napkin, or a teenager doodling wings on their notebook, and I know they're still out there, in every act of imagination that refuses despair. I'm an old man now. My hands shake, my eyes blur, but I still keep a pencil by my bed. Some nights, when the past presses close, I draw. Not the horrors, those live in silence, but the moments in between. Mother S smile over a pot of thin soup, Father's hand ruffling my hair, Lena's laughter echoing in a cellar full of chalk dust. Because the truth is, they tried to erase us. Not just our bodies, but our joy, our tenderness, our right to imagine a world beyond walls. But we drew anyway, with stubs and soot and stolen moments. We drew freedom not as a place we'd reach, but as a practice we'd live. And in doing so, we survived, not just in memory, but in meaning. They say history is written by the victors, but I say memory is drawn by the children, and we were those children. Still are, in a way. Every time someone picks up a pencil and dares to sketch a better world, even if it's just a bird with wings too big for its body, they join us. In the attic, in the hayloft, in the quiet, unbreakable act of saying, I am here, I see you, and I will not forget.